When we're talking about psychology, just like most fields, it's helpful to look back and see throughout history kind of what led us to the point that we are now. How did we get where we are, and where did we start? So our Psychology 2E textbook goes back to the late 1800s, which is when they identified psychology as an actual discipline in the scientific studies. So our text talks about Wundt, who published the Principles of Physiological Psychology. He used the term introspection to start looking at and exploring how humans experience things inside. How do we answer questions such as what is consciousness? And a lot of his studies, the book goes into how he used reaction times to kind of identify, how we're processing things and how long that takes us to process. For example, I think our text reviewed one of the studies in which, when participants saw a light, they would press a button. And so part of understanding how long that may have taken to perceive a light to tell us more about vision and human processing. In 1890, our text covers how James published the Principles of Psychology. And his approach was basically, in a nutshell, influenced by evolutionary theory. So he brought to the table or brought forward that maybe we should be looking at the human beings in general and how we have evolved over time and how that might impact psychology and the different things we might see in terms of what people are experiencing inside and how it relates to what's happening outside, meaning our environment. So kind of pointing towards, hey, let's look at the environment and let's also look at how we have evolved and adapted over time and how that plays a role in psychology. In 1922, our text then goes on to talking about Freud and psychoanalysis and how he was a pioneer in terms of bringing forward the practice of psychoanalysis. And he proposed that there were unconscious factors and that things that we experience in our childhood can impact what's happening with us in terms of our mental health and our psychology and what's kind of going on in the mind. Our text also references in the 1900s several German psychologists that proposed that the inner experience of human beings should be more thought of as a gestalt or whole point of view, meaning that instead of just looking at each little piece, trying to basically look at it as a whole, as far as like our inner experience, instead of breaking it down into those pieces and only focusing on that, trying to see the whole picture of what's going on and how people are experiencing the world. And a lot of their work influenced research on sensation and perception, how we might process different smaller parts into a larger image, for example. And they did a lot of research in that area. So moving to the early 20th century, our text briefly covers behaviorism and humanism. So with behaviorism, some of the pioneers that our text references are Skinner, Watson, and Pavlov. A lot of people have heard of Pavlov in relation to the studies he did with dogs and their salivation. So briefly, some of the research he did was to chime a bell or noise, which basically he would then feed the dogs. And they learned over time that when they heard that bell or that noise, that they would begin to salivate because they were expecting that food, regardless of if the food came. They kind of had learned to associate the noise with the food. So most people have heard of that study, but that was kind of one of the studies related to behaviorism. And then the text also goes into the Skinner box, which some people have already heard of that before they come into an intro psychology class as well, where he created a box where if you put a rat in there, if they learned how to press a lever in the box, then they would be rewarded with food. So they learned over time, okay, if I press this lever, then I get food. So obviously we're talking about research that was basically performed with animals. So with behaviorism, basically the thought is that we can apply some of what we're learning with animals to perhaps what human beings are experiencing as well. So positive reinforcement. can sometimes also, I mean, it's thought to have been applied with humans as well, and further studies have been done. If anybody has ever watched The Office, the television show, you may have seen that episode where Jim is basically making a noise on his computer and giving Dwight a candy every time. And basically over time, when Dwight hears that noise, he's expecting, hey, where's my mint or my mento or whatever he was giving him. And so that's an example of, how that behavior was sort of reinforced with the noise, and he was expecting, to have an outcome. So that's behaviorism in a nutshell. And humanism, so our text reviews humanism, and in particular goes into a little bit of what Maslow and Rogers sort of contributed to that area. And humanism, in general, is a perspective within psychology that emphasizes that there's a potential for good that is innate for all humans. And, the book does go into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I think is a really helpful model just to kind of conceptualize what needs we have as human beings. And then the last piece here that you can see is cognitive revolution starting in the 1950s. Our book goes into Ulrich Nesser, who published Cognitive Psychology in 1967, but they also, of course, listed Noam Chomsky. And I'd like to give a plug in for Aaron T. Beck here, is also kind of thought as one of the other founding fathers of this cognitive therapy movement, where we really begin to see psychologists and researchers begin to start looking at how our internal thoughts influence our feelings and how they're connected to our behaviors, and kind of bringing together eventually what kind of comes together with Aaron T. Beck is cognitive and behavior kind of coming together, which we'll get more into later on in our studies. So in a nutshell, this is just a very brief, outline of, some of the highlights of history and psychology. There's obviously a lot more to it, a lot more we could talk about, and there's actually even a whole course dedicated to the history of psychology. But in a nutshell, these are just some of the highlights that you might want to know as someone initially being exposed to the field of psychology.